Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 18 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. The papers that we'll be reviewing this week, all on Substack, is United States and Germany agree to deployment of U.S. missiles on German soil. United States and South Korea reach a nuclear deterrence agreement. Japan releases its annual defense white paper. And then finally, the Canada, NATO's Arctic Achilles heel. So that was just released yesterday. And the video will be out today, the full video. So please go and check out Substack and please take a look at that video. So, all right. So the first one, the United States and Germany agreed to deployment of U.S. missiles on German soil. It's funny. There's again, I'm old enough. I was during Cold War. I was in the military at the end of the Cold War. And it's... I would say that looking at reading this agreement or this agreement between Germany and U.S., it's like more things change, the more they stay the same. So why this stands out is that in 1987, the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. And that was between President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. And the agreement was to withdraw nuclear-capable missiles from Europe. The treaty was triggered the motive behind the treaty was as when President Reagan was elected president, the Soviets had started deploying SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missiles into the European theater. These were replacements. The SS-20 was a much more capable replacement to some other prior nuclear missiles that the Soviets had in Europe, which includes European Russia. The SS-20 could also be launched and strike most targets in Europe from within European Soviet Union. So the U.S. Under President Reagan, as a counter response to the SS-20 being deployed in Europe, had a counter move where they deployed ground-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, which were nuclear capable, and the Pershing II medium-range ballistic missile, which was also nuclear capable. This was a shorter range weapon than the SS-20. So the Tomahawk cruise missile and the Pershing II, the Tomahawk cruise missile did have at least as long a range as the SS-20. But it was not, of course, being a cruise missile, it was not a ballistic missile. So obviously did not travel as fast. Also traveled in a flatter arc than a ballistic missile, which has that usually has a parabolic flight path. So the Pershing IIs were deployed for the most part, they were deployed in Germany to be a little bit closer to the Warsaw Pact forces. So this was the motivation. So the Russians escalate. They deploy the new upgrade SS-20s. U.S. responds with Tomahawk cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles. And this is, at this point, it was an arms race, not only where we've already had this arms race in the strategic theater, mainly involving ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers such as the B-52, the B-1 in the United States, and I guess the Russians was the backfire and I think it was the Blackjack bombers as well. Obviously, their nuclear bomber force was not as significant as the U.S.'s strategic bomber forces. So this was an arms race that was moving outside of the what we've all typically got understood as the arms race. So the arms race was starting to move into I want to say lower level, because if you get nuclear bombed, you get nuclear bombed. Into much more theater-specific weapons. And this is going into why this was destabilizing, is because prior, when you're talking about a strategic arms race, you're talking about, for the most part, you're talking about at that time, or up to that time, it started changing somewhat, was mutually assured destruction, MAD. It was just the idea is that if you nuke us, we're going to nuke you, and everybody's destroyed. There wasn't a talk of a limited nuclear war. Well, this deployment of Pershing 2s and Tomahawks and SS-20s was moving into the ideas of limited nuclear war, which in itself is escalatory, because the idea was under MAD, which again had started evolving in the late 70s in the U.S., but the Soviets were thinking it too, is it was evolving from the idea of a war that was in the idea of, okay, mutually assured destruction, I kill you, you kill me. The idea with introducing weapons like this, things like the mobile launchers in the Soviet Union, mobile ICBM launchers, the idea of MEMX being mobile as well, which never did happen. It was starting to get into the idea of having a nuclear war, a limited nuclear war, and a nuclear war that was winnable, which is not part of the MAD process. The MAD doctrine is basically everybody dies, everybody loses. So this was becoming an arms race in areas that would make, and the concern was that it would make limited nuclear war more likely. And I'll be writing some more information on that. These are not new thoughts. It's just the history of nuclear warfare. As we hear the saber rattling coming from both NATO, well, okay, the Russians started it first, but NATO and France, France first, and then NATO as a whole, as an organization, started talking about nuclear weapons as well. So I'll be talking more about that, but that's the idea. That's why this was so escalatory. This was becoming an arms race in an area that had not been an arms race in the past. So that was the impetus for the INF Treaty. So the INF Treaty was in effect from 1987. Actually, I think it was 1988 once it was ratified by the Senate and then passed by the whatever the Soviet Union passed it by. I imagine it was the Politburo or the Central Committee or both. I'm not sure. That was a long time ago. Maybe I should have looked that up, but I'm just assuming when Mikhail Gorbachev signed it, that was basically ratification, unless the U.S. didn't ratify it. So it was ratified, I think, in 88 or 89. And it became U.S. policy all the way up to August of 2019 when the U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty. So the U.S. announced withdrawal from the treaty on February 2nd, 2019, citing Russia's violations of Article 15 of the treaty. And so I'm going through the history of this to understand why this decision to put missiles in Germany is so significant, because it is definitely a step backwards towards nuclear, I don't want to say peace, but nuclear de-escalation. We are moving into that escalation cycle and going back into the idea of limited nuclear war. So the U.S. citing a Russian violation, a violation that had been occurring since 2013. The U.S. cited disagreements with that the Soviets had built, I think it was the SSC-8 cruise missile. That was a violation of the agreement because the SSC-8 was deployed in Europe, where the Tomahawk ground-launched was not. This is about ground-launched missiles. So I correct on the INF, it was specifically ground-launched cruise missiles that were banned by the treaty. The SSC-8 was a ground-launched cruise missile that was nuclear capable. So that was a violation in the U.S.'s determination as being a violation to Article 15 of the treaty. And that's, I believe that is a true statement by the U.S., a true concern. But this was something that was ignored by the Russians starting in 2013 when the U.S. brought it up. So it took almost 6 years for the U.S. to make a determination to withdraw from the treaty. The withdrawal took effect on August 2nd, 2019, and it coincided with the request from the U.S. Defense Department to fund intermediate-range ballistic missiles in 2019 as part of the 2020 fiscal year budget. Now, this is not a case where the U.S. says, okay, the only reason we withdrew from the treaty is because we wanted to start building, the U.S. wanted to start building intermediate-range ballistic missiles. That is not necessarily the case. The idea was because the Russians had shown no indications of addressing the SSC-8 cruise missile issue, the U.S. chose to withdraw. But what happened at this point is the U.S. had a capability gap. It did not have anything to counter the Russians' SSC-8 and later SS-26 missiles. One's a cruise missile, SSC-8's cruise missile. SS-26 is I think it's considered a medium range or short range ballistic missile that's nuclear capable. So that's the reason why, is that the reason why it was in 2020 budget is that there was decisions obviously probably well before February 2019. So probably in 2018, the U.S. probably had made a decision to withdraw from the treaty. And when that withdrawal from, and I think President Trump was in charge. I'm not sure who the national security advisor was at the time those decisions were made. It might have been McMaster, but not 100% sure. But the U.S. decided that, okay, we're going to get out of the missile. But then once they got out of the treaty, because of non-compliance of the Russians, the administration was not going to let this just keep dragging on, is when the Russians obviously were not going to address the issue. So at that point, instead of when they decided that they are not going to try to get the Russians into compliance, which they haven't done in 6 years, the U.S. had decided that they were going to withdraw from the treaty, but withdrawing from the treaty meant that there was a capability gap, that the U.S. did not have anything like the SSC-8 to deploy, because, again, the ground launch capability of the Tomahawk had been eliminated. It was still on ships, it's still on submarines, it still could be launched from aircraft, but the ground launch capability was gone. So a decision was made that to address this capability gap, they had to add that into the 2020 physical calendar. So, and that they did. So that was a reason why. It wasn't because the U.S. decided that in 2020 they wanted to start building missiles. It was they wanted to address the gap. It very much Cold War thinking. I understand the logic of it, but it's kind of the Dr. Strangelove type mentality of the two superpowers, and those reflexes don't go away. Not saying it's necessarily wrong. Understand that you don't want them to have an ability that you don't. So that was the driving factor of why they made that decision to put those in the 2020, or those IRBMs in the 2020 physical budget. So the Russians deployed the SS-26 Stone, also known as the Russians called the Iskander, and the SSC-8, which is the cruise missile. The Russians developed the SS-26 Stone, which is a short-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile, and they've deployed these throughout Russia. And they've been using this Iskander as part of their threats of nuclear war. They have been using the Iskander as their, I'll just call it their poster child of their showing off their nuclear capability, and their part of their nuclear saber rattling is moving around the Iskander missiles and holding other exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. So the SS-26 Stone, or Iskander, is a short-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile, and it's being deployed throughout Russia. So Russia has deployed it in Ukraine as a, obviously, as it does have the capability of being a conventional weapon, and they have used it. But its real value to the Russians at this point is less as a ballistic missile, but more as the nuclear part of the nuclear saber rattling, because remember, the Russians are under sanctions. They are getting help from China. China denies it, of course. They're getting help from the North Koreans, who don't deny it. And so also they're getting help from the Iranians, but I think the Iranians are limiting themselves to drones. But the point being is there's not a lot of ability to make additional Iskander missiles at a scale that the Russians would use them in their war in Ukraine. So they do have to kind of hold back on these, because what this is the a highly capable nuclear capable ballistic missile. So this is part of their saber rattling. So they decided to deploy them to their Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad, which sits between Latvia and Poland. Also has access to the Baltic Sea. So they've decided to deploy those weapons. They have not confirmed or denied that they're nuclear capable or they have nuclear weapons. They're not denying that they're nuclear, and they have been using these before as they're part of their nuclear saber rattling. So it's assumed that they are nuclear armed, but that's also the Russians, again, the proper use, if you want to call it, the proper use of strategic ambiguity. They're not going to confirm or deny that those are nuclear capable. They're just going to leave it understood that these are probably being nuclear armed. But again, nobody's confirming it, denying it, but it's assumed that these are nuclear armed. They've also added them to the Leningrad military district, which is a relatively new military district that has taken a heightened importance since the start of the Ukraine war and the Western reaction to the Russian invasion. So this is becoming a more important area again, and these two areas are Baltic regions, which is the potential flashpoint for a future war with Europe. And then they have threatened to move Iskander units to the Finnish NATO border over their displeasure with Sweden and Finland joining NATO as a reaction to the Ukraine invasion. So this is part of their saber rattling. One of the reasons they don't move it south towards the Turkish border is because Turkey has kept relatively good relations with Russia throughout the war. They have tried to get an end to the war. They've also worked. Turkey has also worked well with Ukraine. So the Russians do not want to antagonize the Turks by deploying nuclear capable missiles close to the Turkish border and threaten Turkey, because that would definitely turn Turkey is not intentionally. Well, I mean, it's intentionally, but they're not making themselves out to be, but they are basically a conduit of communications for Russia to the outside world, mainly the West, because again, Turkey is a member of NATO, and Turkey has crazy. This is unreal. Is they've bought SS-400 missiles from Russia. The SS-400 missiles being in a NATO country, really. But anyway, so they were obviously not going to antagonize the Turks with a short-range ballistic missile. So they have deployed these into the Baltic region where they can hit Finland, Norway. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about Norway except from the furthest northern tip, the Arctic Circle part of Norway. They can strike. They might be able to hit Norway, but I'm not 100% sure. But they can definitely hit Finland, Sweden, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. I think parts of Romania. They might be able to go into parts of Eastern Germany. So it does threaten parts of Europe with the new Iskander missile. And again, this is part of that saber rattling because it is a new missile. It's a new toy, and it's considered a highly capable weapon, especially for nuclear warfare. So this is part of the saber rattling that whenever Russia's upset with anybody, they threaten to move Iskander nuclear missiles into the area. And this is what they've been using them for. So now you've got is the violation of SSC-8 cruise missile from 2013, The Russians go ahead and do full deployment at SSC-8. They just go ahead and start putting it forward. The Russians are moving the SS-26. So they're obviously doing terms that would have been banned by the INF Treaty. So the Russians have been acting out on that, at least since 2022, not including what was going on with the SSC-8 cruise missile, which caused the U.S. to withdraw from the treaty. So the U.S. and Germany came to an agreement to deploy U.S. missile systems in Germany. So the system here, unlike the prior agreements in the Reagan administration, these deployments are not permanent locations. These are the ability to rotate missiles in and out of Germany for exercises, temporary deployments, deployments that maybe when international tensions are heightened, they move these missile systems in there. They are airlift capable. I think they can be put in C-17s. I don't think C-130s, but C-17s and obviously C-5A, C-5B. So these are air capable or air portable missiles for ground launch systems. The new system is actually been deployed, not in a nuclear capability, but has been deployed recently in the Philippines as part of one of the exercises with the Philippines that really mussed up China as far as the U.S. deploying temporary. Again, these were temporary deployments. Is deploying these missiles to parts of the Philippines that could reach into Taiwan and parts of mainland China. And the hint is that these could also be nuclear capable. So the U.S. has taken this same missile system, again, which can be conventional and nuclear capable, and they have decided to deploy these systems to Germany on a rotating basis. Now, the system, again, what I just called there, it's called Typhoon Medium Range Capability, MRC, and it puts the U.S. Army back into the nuclear war game. I was in the Army when they removed all the nuclear technicians from the Army because after the withdrawal of the Pershing II and the nuclear-armed cruise missiles that would, again, ground launch would have been by the Army, that position was no longer needed in the Army. So now they're bringing them back. So because it is known that these will be capable of being nuclear-armed. Not saying they're always going to be nuclear-armed when they rotate into Germany, but they can be. Now, the Typhoon Medium Range Capability, MRC, will enable the U.S. Army to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, so the same type of cruise missiles that were deployed in 1983. Obviously, the Tomahawk has had significant upgrades since its first deployment in 1983. And also a ground version of the Navy standard SM-6 multi-capable missile, which can be used to the SM-6 can be used as a anti-missile. It's anti-missile defense. It's one of, I think, two naval missiles that are put on Aegis ships to shoot down as a ability to shoot down missiles. A little considered to have a better capability than the Patriot. Certainly, I'm not sure how they compared the latest Patriot to the SM-6, but the SM-6 is one of the missiles that the Navy has that has a anti-missile capability. Also has a surface to surface capability and a surface to air capability. So this is a missile that is being deployed. Obviously, the Army would focus on the surface to ground capability, or ground to ground, because surface usually means it's being launched from a ship. So surface to surface is ship to ship. So this is probably going to be a ground to ground missile capability. I'm not sure if the Typhoon is going to be eventually upgraded to do a missile defense system, especially if you already have the Patriot. It seems like a overlapping capability. But this is going to give the U.S. Army the capability that they haven't had for a while. It gives the U.S. the capability to be able to deploy these missile systems onto a land system. So it's based on a U.S. Navy system. You look at this ground launch system, and it's in canisters that look very similar to what you see in Patriot, and it's basically these canisters are very called canisters. It's basically where the missile's contained in. It's part of the Navy uses it on their vertical launchers. Basically, it's a vertical launcher that's just been moved into a ground version, and obviously having all the support to go with it, meaning radars and other parts of the combat information to be able to launch this. So so that's what it's based on. That's why they've been able to turn it around so quickly, is because the Tomahawk has been available in vertical launch systems in the Navy, and the SM-6 is vertical launch. So this is talking about something that was in the 2020 budget, and they were able to turn this around and start talking about deployments within 4 years, and they've already deployed them on a rotating basis in the Philippines as part of an exercise. That's why the U.S. is being able to turn it around, because they just converted a effective naval system and made it into a ground launch version. Again, these ideas that these are rotating bases. They are air mobile, so they just put on C-17, C-5s, and they can be moved quickly into a region as needed for exercises, or if regional tensions require that such a deployment of a system be more long-term. So this is something that's going to be available, and I talk about in this paper too about some agreements with between the U.S. and South Korea involving nuclear weapons. You could probably assume, or we can assume, that the Typhoon will be part of that system as well. The deployment has been controversial in Germany, so that was to be expected. But obviously, and I've talked about this before, the Germans of, I guess, call it my generation, were maybe war weary. Maybe they had too much pacifism, I thought, maybe, or they had very pacifist elements within their society. Part of that is due to the U.S. occupation, or the Western occupation of Germany, to as part of the efforts to eliminate the warlike tendencies that the West, the West, not in this case, the non-German West, considered that was in German culture. And also the Germans knew that when they started talking about intermediate range nuclear missiles, West Germany was going to be right in the middle of that, and large parts of their population were in danger of elimination. So a combination of this peace movement and pacifism, and also the Soviets helped support some of this peace movement. Not saying that this was as we call in modern days, an astroturf movement. I think this really truly had grassroots support, but the Soviets egged this on a little bit. I don't have proof of that right off the tip of my fingers, but I think I've read that. It does make sense. We would do the same thing to the Soviets. You think that the Gdansk protests were all completely, they didn't get some type of support from the U.S. or the West? So that was just part of Cold War politics. That's just the way things unfortunately were, which included the ability to try to interfere in elections. That was part of the deal. That was something that's people clutch their pearls over this, but it's been something that's been around. Maybe technology has made the one breakthrough of technology in these days, modern times, is communication. And I'm look at your cell phones, look at your internet, mobile internet, Facebook, and not saying Facebook's part of Russian disinformation, but you have X, you have Facebook, you have Instagram, you have TikTok, you have all these ways to reach people. And that's where the communications of is information. All these new modern devices that we have nowadays, including what's allowing me to talk to you today, is all about communications, information. And so, yes, the election interference is a hotbed issue. It but it has always happened. The only change is it's much more efficient. You can potentially get out to more people, but it used to be very common. They would have paid people in U.S. media to write papers on or write articles on behalf of the Soviet Union. These would make it to the 5 o'clock news. You had you had English versions of Pravda and Izvestia, and the U.S. had Voice of America, where we were transmitting on shortwave out to each other's population. So Izvestia and Pravda had an English version directed towards the U.S. They had a German version. Obviously, the East Germans did things as well in West Germany. So election interference has been part of the Cold War mentality of things, which is funny. This off other subject. The Chinese talk about they don't like Cold War mentality. Well, part of Cold War was trying to interfere with elections in the U.S. or in the West and all the democratic processes. Well, the Chinese have worked like they are some of the biggest interferers in elections in their region. They interfere with elections in Taiwan. They try to threaten Taiwan. They've done the same thing in Hong Kong, lesser extent in the Philippines, definitely a much less extent in Vietnam, because that would probably upset the Russians. So it's just been part of the mentality of things. And so not saying it's right, not saying any claims in the U.S. and Canada of election interference from the Russians or the Chinese. This is nothing new. It's always been there. So the protest movements were inspired by, they were definitely grassroots. They did have some support and inspiration from the Soviet Union. But you're not seeing that now. So now we're talking about deploying nuclear capable missiles, just like we did in the early 80s, meaning the U.S. And there is no protest at all. Nothing. Maybe some minor local protests, but then nothing like what we would see in the 80s, like every weekend where you would see huge crowds in all parts of Germany and West Berlin, England, France, Netherlands. You don't see that anymore. And those big protests were, hey, that's what inspired the iconic songs of 99 Luftballons and the U.S. or the English version of 99 Red Balloons. Those were all inspired by the huge protests in West Germany. So we're not seeing that anymore. There's just pretty much not a peep. So how things have changed, and we get out of a treaty that brought stability to the Europe. That treaty is gone, and now we're both sides with the U.S. deploying the MRC on a rotating basis, and the Russians moving around SS-26 Iskanders throughout whenever they're upset with somebody. So they've kind of moved into that mentality of using nuclear weapons, just like very similar to what they was in the Cold War, except this time nobody's really protesting. So not sure how to take that, but it is interesting. I have my own personal ideas about what it is, but I would like to study it some more before I really start spouting off at it. The reason why we don't see protests like we did, is it because NATO is more unified than it has ever before, and so they're willing to accept this? But NATO was pretty unified in 1983 because they knew what the threat was. So I don't know if it's that or not. So I kind of doubt it. So it's interesting to see what's driving that. So the interesting thing is that the French offered to deploy right now. The French are nuclear capable. They have done some saber rattling of their own, where basically President Macron has said, when Russians are threatened, when President Putin of Russia is threatening nuclear attacks against the West, the U.S. has been kind of like, or the West has kind of backed off, saying, said, no, that's not our intent. Well, Macron just flat out says, hey, we had nuclear weapons too, and we're ready to use them. And so I think he says the English translation was that is that. So I think it was probably a moment of truth and clarity that just stated, hey, we got nuclear weapons too, meaning the West. So as part of Macron's, I've written about this before, about his initiative to try to change Europe in the French image, he has offered to use that nuclear weapons in French policy, they are not integrated into NATO. That is, they say that's a French asset not to be shared, and it's to be used in the French interest only. So again, it's not part of the NATO command structure, unlike U.S. nuclear weapons, when the U.S. decides that when they're going to set aside a portion of nuclear weapons. And that's why you could have, for example, you could have German Air Force launching American nuclear weapons. That doesn't happen. There's no French weapons being launched by Spanish fighters. It's strictly a French. It's been traditionally just a French focus, where that's only for the French national interest, and the French will make that decision. Well, President Macron changed the French policy, where he said the French interest is the European interest, or vice versa. The European interest is of the French interest, and he floated the idea of allowing French nuclear weapons, mainly their ground launch cruise missiles that were outside of INF, because again, the French nuclear missiles are outside of the INF treaty because they were not a signatory of it, and they were deployed, for the most part, their cruise missiles were deployed all the way into France, out of the range of Russia. So the French were never bound by INF, but for the most part, the Russians were not concerned, because of the way there's a relatively small number of French nuclear weapons that were ground-based. Most of them were on the sea or in the Air Force. So the French have offered to deploy their nuclear-armed cruise missiles to Germany. And the idea was that French proposal was to make the EU a nuclear power, to give them actual hard power, because the EU has a bigger economy than the US when you look at it as far as GDP. So the European Union is the biggest single entity as far as GDP goes. Now, it doesn't have the integration like the United States, so it's not, or China for that matter. So it's not really considered a country, but it has significant economic power, but it has no military. It has no hard power. So there's discussions. Part of Macron's proposals, the EU army. I've written about that before, so check that out. It's on my Substack. Good read. Interesting proposals about what's the challenging of bringing a European Union army into existence. So especially now that the UK, United Kingdom, has left the European Union, the United Kingdom was a staunch opponent of this. And again, you have to have unanimous consent in the EU to make any decision. Well, Britain's gone, the biggest ones that were opposed to it. So Emmanuel Macron was trying to give the European Union, in his future mind, was to give the European Union that hard power to go with their economic power, something that they don't have. So the European Union can't speak with the same voice and authority as the US or China, because both those countries have militaries. And for the most part, Europeans' military power is tied into NATO, which is a separate organization of the European Union. So the Germans just flat out, they just said no, they didn't want French nuclear weapons, but they wanted U.S. nuclear weapons. So that's interesting, because it used to be Germany and France under the previous Chancellor, Angela Merkel, were very much close to being integrating with the French. Well, the current Olaf Scholz, the current Chancellor of Germany, is not as aligned with the French as the prior chancellor. Now, I know they came from different parties. One's, we'll talk about this here shortly. I won't get into that part, but I'll talk about it here at the end about the difference in the parties. So Germans say no to French missiles, but they say yes to American missiles, all within a year. Maybe because the negotiations for American missiles were already in the advanced stages, and they decided to turn that down. It's unclear on that, but it's the French get turned down by the Germany's and give a green light to the U.S., which had to burn the French up, because this is another time that the U.S. and France have, or the U.S. has undercut France. Now, what this does also is it means that Germany is acknowledging that it is reliant on the U.S. to continue to subsidize its defense needs. Now, the Germans have put a plan out there for 100 billion euros to jumpstart their defense. That $100 billion, because they actually, weird is that I'd have to go back through the funding mechanisms of Germany. They have to pay interest on that. So that $100 billion is not 100, or 100 billion euros is not 100 billion euros. It has to pay interest out of that as well. And there's some other costs involved in that. So that 100 billion euros is probably something closer to 75 billion euros once everything's paid out on it. Because, they have to pay taxes on it. Like our federal government, the U.S. federal government doesn't pay taxes on anything, but they'll tax the crap out of you, but they don't pay taxes on anything. So it's kind of interesting that a procurement from the German government has to pay a value-added tax, a VAT. But I guess that makes sense, is because if the German government didn't pay the VAT when it buys it from other companies, those companies would be stuck with a bill, and it'd be an unprofitable exchange for them. So I guess it does make sense in a way, just a different way of funding mechanisms of government between the United States and Germany. So, but it's an acknowledgement, even with the $100 billion, Germany has basically acknowledged they need the U.S. to continue to subsidize their defense. Hopefully this means that they do not feel like they have to meet the 3% or the 2% obligation. The German Defense Minister Pistorius has said no, they have to. They think that Germany will have to get into the 3% range to meet their needs in the future. But I know there's budget concerns that they could ever reach that point. So Germany has basically acknowledged that they have to have the U.S. in Germany, which means the U.S. will probably have influence in German defense decisions. Now, the U.S. has always had a high-level role of helping make decisions within Germany, especially during the Cold War, because U.S. is the biggest NATO partner. U.S. maintains large military presence in Germany and has been a guarantor of German security. Again, especially when Germany was on the front line. Germany's not literally on the front lines anymore. That's pushed much further to the east. But it's an acknowledgement that the Germans need help, and that means the U.S. is probably going to extend influence into German defense decisions. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, if the Germans will continue to try to build their defenses and just the U.S. having an additional role in Germany is just a stopgap until they get fully on their feet defense-wise, or if this is Germany's going to become reliant on the U.S. and not try to be independent in defense needs. So more to come on that. But this again, the Germans turned down the French, but they accept the U.S. So this is not the first time the U.S. has undermined French efforts. So in defense matters. So again, Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, is willing to align Germany closer to the U.S. At the expense of pursuing tighter integration within the European Union. And this is something that France and Macron, in his latest push for, has been really pushing towards. And the Germans have basically said no. They've gone towards the U.S. route. And the French have been wanting to push the U.S. out of tighter European affairs, or being so influential in European affairs, because the French do not care for the idea that a non-European country is so, or is the main voice of European security. And he would like to push the U.S. Out of that role. And he says, well, it's because the U.S. needs to focus on Asia, and that's an area that the Europeans cannot focus on. It needs to be the U.S. So the Europeans should be willing to let the U.S. Leave Europe. And again, the idea is that he was in this Gaullism type view of France, is that France would fill that void. Well, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. It's the Germans are aligning closer to the U.S. And not towards France, which means, again, that's going to delay integration in the European Union. It means that there's probably not going to be any EU army in the near future, again, which would be something that France would like to see. And again, the U.S. did the same thing to France over the Australian submarine deal. The French had already signed an agreement with the Australians that they were going to buy, the Australians, were going to buy French diesel submarines in their, which would be effective against the Chinese Navy. Again, French don't build junk. They make very capable weapon systems. But the U.S. came in there along with the U.K. and offered the Australians nuclear submarines, which have much better range than the diesel versions. So this is, when you're talking about the ranges of the Pacific, having a nuclear capable or having a nuclear powered submarine is certainly an advantage over having diesel powered submarines. So this is a definite advantage. So the U.S. crowded out France in decisions in the Pacific on a contract that was already signed. So this really hurt U.S. French relations, and probably some of that pride has been affected in some of the more critical decisions that France has directed towards the U.S., even coming into the NATO summit earlier this month. So it's just interesting that the U.S.-French ping-pong ball of criticism, and of course, Macron is much weaker now that he signed that unholy, or he pushed that unholy alliance of leftist coalition to stop Marine Le Pen and National Rally from becoming more powerful in the French Parliament. So Macron is definitely weakened. He's probably not going to be able to really be a credible threat or a credible force in Europe to try to undercut the U.S. So public reaction in Germany is that, well, the CDU and CSU, the Christian Democrat Union, which is what Angela Merkel, the previous chancellor, was part of, they endorsed Chancellor Scholz's decision, and the Greens and the FDP, the FDP, which is part of Scholz's SPD-led coalition, opposed the agreement. So the primary opposition parties support Chancellor Scholz's decision on this, and major parts of his coalition are opposed to this agreement. But again, we're not seeing anything like what we saw in Europe in the 1983s. But this does weaken Scholz's coalition, and chances are he's not going to be assigned some grand coalition with the CDU and the SPD. That's probably not going to happen, not this time around. And it's not leading to snap elections in Germany. I think Chancellor Scholz is going to be able to keep his governing coalition together, but it does weaken him in some of the decisions where these parties might abandon him, and so it could weaken him politically, even though he's got support of the primary opposition parties on this decision. This deployment of missiles that overshadowed Macron's criticism of the U.S. and Germany over offering Ukraine NATO membership, which is, again, that was some of that criticism that Macron had going into the NATO summit in Washington in early July. Germany and the U.S. get criticized by France, and Germany and the U.S. sign a nuclear forces agreement or missile agreement that undercuts the French. So did Macron know about that going into the NATO meeting? Probably. Just more back politics going on in NATO. So interesting times to see what it's going to go, see if it'll cause any other agreements. The Russians have, of course, threatened retaliation, have not stated what that retaliation is, but Russia's got a lot of things going on in the retaliation bucket right now. So part of the retaliation bucket is part of this next story. The United States, or the next article, the United States and South Korea reach a nuclear deterrence agreement. And this is part of a reaction to the Russia and North Korea have been cooperating since the start of the Ukraine war to provide munitions to Russia to support a war effort. That includes about at least 1 million artillery rounds and an unspecified number of ballistic missiles from North Korea being sent to Russia to help them in their war effort. So there was no formal agreement between the two countries over this. This was just a trade of the North Koreans got some unspecified support from the Russians. I've talked about this before. North Koreans are very poor. They definitely relish it, disrupting the world order, but they are in a position where they just can't give away artillery rounds and ballistic missiles and not get anything out of the deal. But the Russians have not talked about openly what they're giving the North Koreans in return, but the North Koreans are getting something. So the concern is the probably some form of technology exchanges, but we'll talk about that more. So that was done prior to the winter of 2023, 2024, when the Russians really needed more artillery in part of their defense efforts as they ramp up their own domestic production, which is hampered somewhat by the sanctions, though China is definitely helping the Russians out in that regard. So in June 2024, Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un signed a defense and security agreement, which is basically bringing back a Soviet-era defense agreement between the two countries that was not assumed by the Russians when the Soviet Union disintegrated. That didn't happen at all. There's many treaties that the Russians assumed from the Soviet Union. This was not one of them. This one died when the Soviet Union died. They basically had brought this agreement back very close to being letter for letter. This defense and security agreement is not like up to NATO levels type Article 5 type agreements, but it does allow the state that both sides will try to help each other as much as they can in case of war. So they re-signed that agreement, and the North Koreans did send up to 4 Army engineering brigades to occupied Ukraine in the Donbass. They're not supposed to be combat. They're supposed to be assigned to duties to help rebuild sections of the country, Again, this is not inside Russia. This is inside occupied Ukraine that these North Korean units are going to be operating in. So outside of the foreign forces agreement, or the foreign forces that have been added to the forces, like volunteers from India and volunteers for fighting for the Russians, Chinese volunteers fighting for the Russians, but then you also have American volunteers or British volunteers fighting for Ukraine. This is where you actually have a actual country sending their armed forces into Ukraine. So now you've got North Koreans deploying units, military units in Ukraine, and you got the French that have their own units from the French Foreign Legion operating in Ukraine. There is a payment structure for this. I think the Russians are paying up to $150 million a year for these 4 brigades to North Korea. So they make a little bit of money. Seems like not a lot of money, but they are getting paid for it. So when the Russians and the North Koreans signed this agreement, there was concerns coming from the South Korean president, and he expressed concerns over agreements. It would require South Korea to increase its support for Ukraine's need for lethal aid. So it's kind of like if the North Koreans are going to be playing a role in the Ukraine war, the South Koreans are going to play a role in the Ukraine war. South Korea has been providing some support to Ukraine, but it's been in the form of non-lethal aid. South Korea has also been heavily involved in the NATO buildup of military forces. Once many NATO countries decided that this war in Ukraine was a wake-up call, that they needed to spend more on military, South Korea has been a provider of military goods to NATO countries, not parts to be sent to Ukraine, but actually helping NATO countries. For example, you're going to see South Korean modern main battle tanks being bought by Poland. So South Korea is looking at this as that they may start providing lethal aid to Ukraine in response to this Russian agreement. Russia needs to procure weaponry and ammunition from North Korea and Iran. And so it's obviously this demonstrates that the war is taking a strain on the Russian ability to produce weapons. So even though they're talking about going to a war economy, they cannot keep up with the needs that they have in the modern war. So again, it kind of goes in there. What is North Korea getting out of this deal? So one area that is that the Russians are going to use their position on the United Nations Security Council to obstruct the imposition of any new UN sanctions against North Korea. North Korea is sending ballistic missiles, and they've found ballistic missile parts from North Korea. So basically, an exploded missile parts were found in Ukraine, and they were identified as being North Korea. That is a violation of UN sanctions. The Russians will block any new sanctions against North Korea, though at this point, I don't know how sanctions really hurt North Korea. They're sanctioned more than any country in the world, even more than the Russians. But they will also prevent renewal of any current sanctions program. So many of the sanction programs that come in the United Nations, they have to be reviewed and renewed like every 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. The Russians have already shown that they will block any type of renewals of current sanction programs since North Korea. So North Koreans are getting that help from the perspective of the United Nations. So the Russians, that's something the Russians are going to do, help for the North Koreans. The nuclear weapons program that the North Koreans have and their missile and rocket program are domestic. This is something that, for the most part, the North Koreans have created on their own. They've taken some basic rockets from the Russians before and really have upgraded, and they've kind of developed their own rocket system. Obviously, they've created their own nuclear weapons program, and they're a significant threat to Japan, the U.S., and South Korea. So the concerns that when you're talking about these domestic programs of these nuclear program, these missile programs, these are concerns that Japan, U.S., and South Korea, because North Korea is threatening everybody in their, quote, neighborhood with being able to attack or willingness to turn attacking even the United States. And they do have some missile capabilities, so I wouldn't say they're operational, that could deliver a nuclear weapon in theory against the U.S. So the concern is that once North Korea has a capability that's operational, where they can actually put nuclear weapons on warheads, is that they will press for concessions from the region and the world, and it will have the ability to strike the U.S. Of course, the U.S. has a missile defense system that's specifically developed against North Korea, so there is that. But the North Koreans are going to take this program that they have and threaten the region, trying to get concessions, and otherwise they'll say they'll start a war. So it means that none of North Korea's adversaries, including the U.S., is safe from North Korea's demands. So that is a concern. That is the North Koreans tried to develop their capability, but a lot of that capability is not there. The U.S. is not sure that they can truly operate a spy satellite, even though they did put a satellite in orbit. The U.S. is not sure that they have the capability of developing reentry vehicles for their nuclear warheads without destroying the warhead itself. Do they have the ability to deliver these accurately? It's all these things are unclear, and so even though they have the capability in each individual piece part, it's doubtful that they really have that capability at this time. Now they will get it over time. I mean, I think the North Koreans have proved themselves very, looking at their budget, very thrifty, but very innovative in how they're getting there. I mean, even their crude nuclear weapons, they got there. They were able to create nuclear weapons. So they will probably eventually be able to get there where they can build a reentry vehicle for nuclear warhead, where they can get into creating more capable rockets, again, reentry vehicles, spy satellites. And this is the concern that comes up with this deal between the Russians and the North Koreans, because the one thing that comes up for is that the Russians said, hey, we will give the North Koreans weapons, advanced weapons, and they can use them however they want, just as the West has allowed Ukraine to use their weapons however they want. So this is kind of a retaliatory measure where the Russians threaten retaliation against the West for allowing Ukraine to use Western donated weapons to attack mainland Russia. The Russians in return are promised to give advanced weapons to the North Koreans, and tell them they can use it however they want to use them. So again, kind of mirroring the Western support of Ukraine weapons to be used against Russia. So the concern now, so that's part of the concern, but the issue is Russia is fighting a war that obviously they're going to the North Koreans for weaponry. They're going to the Iranians for weaponry. I mean, these are not big powerhouses of military, advanced military weapons. Though, again, just said, North Koreans did develop nuclear weapons on their own, so maybe you don't need to be snoozing on them. But obviously, Russia is going to the North Koreans for nuclear weapons. So how much, or not nuclear weapons, for weaponry. So how much advanced weaponry can the Russians give up and give to the North Koreans when they're having to come to the North Koreans to get basic military weapons? So this seems like more of a statement of intent, but it's a more of an in theory type than an actual concrete threat to North Korea. Especially as long as this Ukraine war is going on, the Russians are not going to have the ability to send large amounts of sophisticated weapons to North Korea when they need those sophisticated weapons for the war. So this has caused an alarm bell. So the concern is the Russians' only tangible thing they can give the Russians or give the North Koreans is expertise. Give them that technical expertise to speed up that timeline of miniaturizing nuclear weapons, creating reentry vehicles, helping them create solid rocket rockets. Solid rocket motors are an important part of first strike, because right now the North Koreans are using liquid fueled. And so you have an indication if they were going to try to launch a nuclear attack, is they have to refuel that. They would have to fuel that missile. And that's easier that gives you some head up or some early warning that something is coming. So that allows the strike, the counter strike prior to the launch. So liquid fuel rockets are definitely not something that's considered a first strike weapon, but solid rocket motors are, because you don't need to go in there and fuel the rockets and stuff like that. Because again, most of the rocket fuels, especially the North Koreans, they're not using the most sophisticated rocket fuel. It's corrosive, so you can't keep it in it. Or if it's cryogenic, you can't keep it at the cold temperatures forever. You can't keep them in steel. If it's corrosive, you can't keep them in tanks for long periods of time. So you eventually have to pull out the fuel and put either something in exchange when you pull fuel out, and you have to put something, because many of these rockets are fragile and they'll collapse on their weight. So you have to put something in exchange when you pull the fuel out. So again, it's a much more complicated process. So usually there's a reason why the Russians and the United States and other advanced countries, France, UK, the reason why they don't use liquid fueled rockets, why solid rocket boosters, because it gives you an actual capability to be a first strike weapon. So the concern is that the Russians are going to give all this information, all this technology, or the technology exchanges where an expertise of how to build solid rocket fueled engines, how to miniaturize warheads, how to do work on guidance. These are the things that really speeds up the North Korea's program. And as I said earlier, it's when North Korea can credibly threaten South Korea, Japan, the United States, then they can really start making changes in the world like that and become a recognized nuclear power just by threatening. And so the Russians can help speed that timeline up for the North Koreans to allow them to be a more significant player in their disruptive campaign in the world. I call it a disruptive campaign because I have not seen anything where the North Koreans have ever wanted to become a, quote, responsible actor on the world stage. So you don't see the North Koreans taking a nuclear capable, solid rocket miniaturized warheads and just somehow spread peace in the world. So this is considered a threat to the South Koreans because that's what they see the potential of this agreement is. And so the South Koreans have asked the U.S. to make a clear statement on the potential of a nuclear attack from North Korea and what the U.S. will do in return. Now, South Korea is part of what's called the Indo-Pacific 4, IP4, NATO partnership program. And this was a top agenda item they took to the Washington NATO summit in early July. The U.S. and South Korea is expected to establish integrating of U.S. nuclear capability and deterrence as part of South Korea's defense. So the U.S. did sign an agreement of understanding on the sidelines of the NATO summit that they would provide extend the nuclear umbrella to South Korea. Now, the nuclear umbrella of the U.S. has always been available to the South Koreans, but at the end of the Cold War, or just before the end of the Cold War, the U.S. withdrew all nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. Not saying they pulled them all out of the region, but they pulled them out of the Korean Peninsula as a show of nuclear disarmament. And again, they moved them back to the U.S. Some went to Japan, Okinawa, the Guam, but they removed them from there. So the U.S. has said that they will reintroduce nuclear weapons closer to South Korea and on the South Korean Peninsula as a response to this agreement between the Russians and the North Koreans. So the one thing the South Koreans didn't get is that the U.S. didn't say that they would use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack on South Korea from North Korea. Which again, strategic ambiguity says you don't say that, but they've got a very clear statement from the U.S. And trying to prove that the U.S. will not abandon the South Koreans in case of a nuclear attack from North Korea. So it's the idea to provide some assurances that the U.S. will not abandon South Korea, especially if North Korea creates a weapon that can attack the U.S. mainland. That last thing the South Koreans want is the U.S. to pull out of the region under the threat of a North Korean nuclear attack. Now, I don't think that happen, but this has been a traditional fear of any country that's been under the nuclear umbrella of the U.S. So this is not only as a statement from the U.S. perspective of assuring the South Koreans that this is not part of the U.S. attempt, but it is also an attempt to prevent the South Koreans from creating their own nuclear weapons. That's not stated, but obviously the South Koreans do not need to create or can't justify a nuclear weapons program of their own if they have increased nuclear protection from the United States, including the deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons on South Korean soil. So again, no protests coming from the South Koreans, and we've seen those before too. Not, of course, not to the extent of what you saw in Europe in the 80s. So it's basically the North Koreans' ability to become a recognized nuclear power began before the start of the Ukraine war. But the fact is that now that it's an integral part of call it the supply chain of Russia and their war effort, this has elevated North Korea's status within the Russian sphere. And again, they're going to get something in return. There's also questions around this program as well as is with this new defense treaties outside of the technology transfers, which are not stated in the agreement. But one thing that states is that if there's an attack on one, that the other country will come to the aid of the other in as much as they can. So one open question that was asked, and Putin didn't answer it, but he kind of answered it too, that he kind of left it open against strategic ambiguity, is he was asked by reporters that if U.S., for example, if Western weapons, so we'll just say example, a U.S. weapon is used to attack a target within Russia, is that considered a attack on one from another and would trigger the agreement? So it wouldn't mean that North Korea would go to war with the U.S., but would it mean that the North Koreans would aid the Russians in their war against Ukraine? So could you see, let's say, a U.S. TACMS missile attacks Belgorod and does some serious damage, and the Russians go to the North Koreans and say, hey, as part of this agreement, you said you would aid us. And then you see North Korean troops outside the 4 engineering brigades arrive in Ukraine. So there is concern is, could this trigger the North Koreans to become more involved in the Ukraine war? President Putin didn't say no, and he didn't say yes. He left it purposely open. Again, the North Koreans can't do anything for free. They don't have the luxury in their economy to just start generously giving away things. So they would want something in return. Not sure what the capability of the North Korean military is in a modern war, if they'd be more of a hindrance, but they could occupy parts of or they could take over occupation duties and occupy parts of Ukraine and free up Russian forces as well. Also a political statement that it's a widening war that's becoming part of a widening war that's turns the Ukraine war into more and more of an international war. So more to come on that. I don't think it's going to come that. I think there's real questions about the reliability of North Korean military, again, because they run some very, very old equipment when you look at their actual forces on the ground. And the Russians do not have the luxury on their side of being able to provide new modern weapons to North Koreans and train them up, especially as long as they're expending as much material as they are in Ukraine. So another thing to keep an eye on. So again, these things are perpetual and just keep going on and on and on. So next paper, we'll talk briefly about the video script for the midweek review. Japan releases its annual defense white paper. So Japan's Defense Minister Kihara Minoru released the annual defense white paper on July 12th, 2024. And he basically has stated that Japan is in the greatest global crisis since World War II. Now, the reason he says that, obviously you've got the Ukraine war going on, but Japan is routinely threatened by North Korea. It has very tense relationship with China with its demands throughout the China Sea and all the way to the Sea of Japan. So there's unclaimed islands, but also there's unresolved islands from World War II between, or there's occupation of the Sakhalin Islands is unresolved since prior to World War II. So there's tensions between the Russians and the Japanese. So the Japanese are faced by threats from all over. And so they've talked about that there is disruptive claims throughout the region that justifies that Japan needs to be aware of the strategic situation that they're in. They are basically surrounded by, not surrounded, but they have enemies on all sides from the north, from the Russians, and then to the south, you have the Chinese and the South Koreans. So they have threats all around. And again, all of them are nuclear armed, and Japan is not. Now, this white paper didn't say anything about nuclear weapons or anything like that, but it did talk about updating the U.S.-Japan security alliance to make it more adaptive to the modern battlefield. But that did not say anything about nuclear weapons. But Japan is within the nuclear umbrella of the United States. And again, this was not a detailed paper as far as what Japan was going to do. It talked about some of the systems that they were interested in being able to develop. They're wanting to develop their own standoff missile capability, which is the Ukraine war has proven that this has become a important aspect of modern war on top of drones. Integrated air and missile defense, because it's on top of those ballistic missiles. You have to be able to find a way to shoot them down. So it also considers drone defense. The paper says that the white paper says that the Japan will acquire U.S.-made Tomahawk cruise missiles. These are not going to be nuclear armed, not like what talk about the rotation in Germany being nuclear capable. These will be U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles to be used by Japan, and they will not be nuclear armed. Plus, what's called a Type 12 surface-to-ship missile system is going to be upgraded, and this is important to the Japanese, especially as they could deploy them onto some of their southern islands and even to the northern islands, though. I think Russia being tied up in the war in Ukraine is less of a threat to the Japanese. For the most part, the threat is going to come from the south, from China. So these the ship missile systems are mobile systems, so they can be deployed to southern islands, and these could be important aspects of defending Japan from invasions if China decides to invade Taiwan. I can't remember the islands off the top of my head, but a number of islands, Japanese islands, are near Taiwan, and so it's believed that the China, if they decide to invade Taiwan, are going to have to invade these islands to help protect their northern approaches. So that brings Japan into the war. So maybe these islands that they're looking at is deploying Type 12 anti-ship missiles to help defend it against incoming invasion force from China. Again, all theory, but it does make sense that this is something that they're looking out for. The concern is also about the North Koreans becoming an enabler of Russia, and sending troops to Ukraine. And so the concern is that North Korea is going to get something in return. And we talked about briefly from the Russians. So the Japanese are concerned about this to the point that Japanese and South Korea have formed a pact with the United States, with each other. Now, Japan and South Korea have, we'll just call it history. And it's not a good history. And so there's a lot of resentment between South Koreans and the Japanese. And so even though they have the common enemies, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the South Korean and Japanese have always been traditionally, since the end of it goes past World War II. They have been, because of some of the inhuman, cruel occupation of the South Korean or the Korean Peninsula by the Japanese. There is, and North Korea also have this resentment, there's a lot of Korean resentment, both South and North Korean, towards Japan. So even as the U.S. has been the binding agent in the Western Pacific of all these various groups of like-minded countries, the South Koreans and the Japanese have been I don't want to say friends, but they haven't been enemies. Um, and there are still hard feelings in the relationship, and it shows through in many of the diplomatic communications when you see them posted about each other. Is they are starting to work together now. They've actually formed. Both are part of the NATO IP4. Um, Again, because these countries are both like-minded, and the North Korean threat has become so much that the U.S. has formed a formal agreement between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Now, there's no bilateral agreements between the Japanese and the South Koreans. It's the U.S. is still involved between the two, but it's the first time ever that the Japanese and South Koreans are in a true formal defense pact. They've signed other agreements through economic categories. I think some friendship treaties, stuff like that, but they've never been close. This is now where the Japanese and South Koreans are talking about working together in defense needs, along with the U.S. The white paper does say, again, it points out the North Korean threat, which is nuclear, but Japan, from that point of view, is they look at this as more of a South Korean U.S. issue, though Japan is threatened by the North Koreans. They really focus that China is the main threat in the region. They talk about the Ryukyu Arc, which is a series of islands that's closest to Taiwan and would likely need to be seized by the Chinese to prevent any intervention from the Japanese or Americans, or at least where they couldn't directly intervene into the Taiwan Straits. So that's some of the discussions about it. So Japan, in this white paper, just talks about reinforcing that it's going to have to improve its defense capability, including standoff missiles that basically have longer range. They are going to add an Aegis defense system or more Aegis defense systems to their ships. This will give them an anti-missile capability. One of the things is when Japan has North Korean missiles fired over it, the U.S. has deployed Aegis-capable ships in the region to provide that at least a minimal form of missile defense against North Korean missiles impacting Japan. So Japan's looking at building this own capability of their own by creating more Aegis system naval ships. It talks about that the cornerstone of Japanese security is that alliance with the United States. But Japan is also, again, as I talked about, they're part of NATO IP4, are also part of AUKUS Pillar 2 development program, which is to create advanced military systems and be able to deploy them in a much more rapid rapid timeline than what we've seen in the past. This is probably eventual steps that you might see Japan actually become a formal member of AUKUS. Again, talked about the trilateral agreement between the U.S. and South Korea. Also, Japan is partnering with the Philippines as a part of their issues that the Philippines deals with in the West Philippine Sea and issues of free navigation of the South China Sea. So Japan has actually formed a reciprocal partnership agreement with Japan, where they can temporarily rotate forces on each other. So Japan has talked about this in that white paper. They discussed that this is a critical part of the strategy of a free and open Pacific. The one issue that came out of this is Japan, and this is no secret, Japan's population has actually dropped in the last 10 years. So I think they were at 128 million, 129 million 10 years ago. Now they're down to 126 million. So they're in a shrinking population, just like the Chinese are. And the manpower is a critical problem because first off, Japanese people are not having as many kids. And so that means there's fewer and fewer young people. And the military definitely prefers younger people for obvious reasons. And they have to compete this ever shrinking pool of young people. The Japanese military is having to compete with government and private industry to get these people. So it's become a true concern for the Japanese. So even when they look at introducing more and more automated systems, into their defense sector. Again, drones and automated systems that can run ships with fewer sailors. It's critical importance because they are looking at the actual ability is that they see that there is a security issue mainly against China, but North Korea and Russia. And there is a real concern that they may not have the people to invest in being able to maintain or even implement these programs if they don't have the people to run them. So that is definitely a concern for the Japanese, just as it is for the Ukrainians being demographically challenged. The Japanese are running into it, and in the future, China is going to be running into that. That's been something that's been making the papers lately. Peter Zion, who's on YouTuber, he's talked pretty well about it a couple months ago on his YouTube channel. So definitely an interesting discussion. So Japan's talking about their demographic challenges of being able to maintain. They understand they have a security issue, but people is a real problem. And that tells you something that in a white paper about the defense quality where they talk about the personnel issues or the lack of. So final paper came out. I think the video is released today. Is the Canada, NATO's Arctic Achilles heel. What we run into, we'll just talk briefly about this one. Feel free to go out and check the paper out. Is the paper that came out this week and also the video that's coming out later today. I'm recording this earlier in the afternoon, so I think the video is coming out in 15 minutes or so. So the Canada focus is obviously Canada has a very large part of the Arctic Circle as part of its northern border. There's the countries that have Arctic borders, and hopefully I can name them all here, is you have Russia, which is a non-NATO member, obviously. And then you have the United States through Alaska. You have Canada. You have Norway, Finland, Sweden, and then you have Iceland, and you have Greenland. And Greenland is not a country of its own. That's actually Denmark. So those are the countries that have Arctic, that are part of the Arctic region. Just like the Baltic is talked about, the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake. The Arctic region is become an area too that the NATO countries dominate in that region, except for Russia. Russia's a massive country, I think, as all of you know. And so they have the biggest section of their country along the Arctic. Second biggest is Canada, which is still pretty significant. Canada being the second largest country in the world as far as geographic landmass. So those two countries alone have a large section of the Arctic. And this poses a challenge for NATO because Canada's military forces are in a poor state right now, and with all their services being less than 50% of their readiness factor. So that means even their theoretical, no country ever gets the theoretical strength, but they're well below, they're 50% of their theoretical strength. So it's a significant challenge to the Canadians, as well as they're just they're having recruiting issues as well. So why this is becoming more and more important is that the ice sheets in North Pole have retreated, and it's opening up regions of the Arctic that has not been passable before. The sea route that the Canadians use is called the Northwest Passage. And the Arctic is the shortest way to move forces between the Atlantic and the Pacific is to move them through the Arctic. So it's easier to move forces in there. The reason why it's always been problematic is because it's ice. It has a lot of ice, so you can't move a lot of ships through there. So as the ice packs start retreating, it's opening up sections of the Arctic which had not been available in the past. So again, Canada has the Northwest Passage. and the Russians have what's called the Northern Sea Route, and the NSR. And well, let me go back and say is, excuse me, is both these countries recognize that they both have sea routes. They have accepted each other's sea routes. They don't cross into each other, and so there's this basic calm that's been in the North Arctic between the two countries and the maintenance of the sea routes. The only reason Canada and Russia for the most part, and the U.S. also because you have to go around Alaska, but the Northwest Passage for the most part is dominated by Canada. These are the only two ways of moving forces between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The other countries do not really have the ability to pass ships between the two regions. So the other factor is, but this covers everybody in the Atlantic, or in the Arctic, is that the retreating ice also means that natural resources, gas, oil, rare earth minerals are now available to be harvested or exploited, however you want to call it. So now there's going to be a race to try to get at these resources. So the Russia has an interest in improving their navigation of the NSR. Their sea route actually has more issues with ice than what the Northwest Passage does in Canada, mainly because Canada is able to operate the Northwest Passage a little further south in the Arctic Circle than what the Russians are able to. So they've been able to more successfully operate it. So there's concern is that the Northwest Passage and the the Northern Sea Route are going to become more active as far as seeing navigation. It's going to become more active as it's used to start building up infrastructures to exploit natural resources. And a big concern is that China is talking about being involved in the Northern Sea Route and helping build some of the infrastructure along the way, because China is becoming more and more involved. So they're working with the Russians, because obviously China is not an Arctic country, but they're helping the Russians develop the natural resources in this area, but also as a way to ship products on a shorter route from China to Europe. Also, it means that they can move naval forces much more easily. Think about China moving naval forces from China and operate into the Atlantic by just going through the NSR from Russia, through Russia. That means that most of their ships would not be impacted by being interdicted by Western navies or India's Navy, where they could just move forces into the Atlantic, military naval forces into the Atlantic at a much easier than what they can theoretically do now. And again, with building infrastructure on the way, they would be able to have fueling stations and other areas, most likely not repair facilities, but a way to actually maintain moving both commercial and military ships through the Russia's NSR. Also, the Arctic, because again, curvature of the Earth is the shortest route for missile launches. If you can launch over the poles, it reduces the early warning that a country has of an attack coming. And so it's also the prime location for anti-missile defense systems. The Finnish, the Swedish, I don't think the Norwegians, and the U.S. out of Kodiak, I believe, is looking at creating more launch facilities in the in those regions. Now, putting rocket launch facilities in outside of anti-missile defense, putting rocket launch capability in the poles is a terrible idea from the aspect of the easiest way to get something in orbit is launch as close to the equator as possible. That's why the Russians have their primary launch facility in Kazakhstan. That's why we launch out of Florida. SpaceX is developing the capability to launch out of the Gulf Coast in Texas, which is about the same equatorial latitude as Cape Canaveral. That's why the Europeans launch out of Guyana. Because again, launching off the equator is the fastest, easiest way to get a spacecraft in orbit. Now, why you look at it, it's like, well, why are we talking about this? Well, there's other systems that need it's important to be in poles. So when the U.S., for the most part, when it launches a mission that's called a north to south, which is an orbit that's not going along the equator, but goes from north to south. So that could be for the most part, that's spy satellites. That could be communication satellites to provide more communications into the far north. There's also scientific collections. That's launched out of Vandenberg out of California. So it's a fair amount of distance to move a north-south launch, but it is capable of do out of Vandenberg. I call it Vandenberg Air Force Base, but it's actually Space Force Base. And the Russians have a launch facility in Murmansk or near Murmansk. That's what they use for their launch, for their north-south. So these is where you want to put something into either a polar orbit or north-south orbit. So the north-south orbit is going around the poles, going from the North Pole to South Pole. You don't really see South Pole to North Pole going south to north. It's north to south because just the way of we don't launch out. Nobody's launching out of the Antarctic Circle. So, and also putting something in polar orbit. It's just a lot easier to do it from a higher elevations. That's the only reason you would want to launch from these facilities. So now it's becoming more and more important as we see a more and more connected world. As I said last week, the U.S. is much more reliant on satellites than what the Russians are. So obviously having launch facilities in the northern regions is going to become more and more important to the to military capabilities, and NATO knows this. So they see a lot of issues with the Arctic, and you have resources that need to be protected. You have commerce to be protected. You have a land border in Canada. Also, Russia has a land border in that area. So obviously missile defense, early warning systems, satellite launches, maritime and naval forces moving through that route. So it's becoming a focus item for NATO. And so Canada, with its NWP and having the longest NATO border in the region, is unprepared for this increased NATO role. So this is not considered the primary flashpoint of a future war. I think the Baltics is still the focus area. The Black Sea region is probably another focus area for NATO. But this is an area that is of importance to NATO. And Canada having the Northwest Passage and also having the second longest border in the Arctic means that it has to have some credible defense capability to defend this new NATO priority, and they don't have it. Again, readiness for all their services, Navy, Air Force, and Army, is at or below mid-50s to mid-40s. It's an abysmal state of readiness. You look at the age of their equipment, they're talking about by the time they replace their F-18s, not F-18 Super Hornets, they're F-18s, they could be up to 60 years old before they're ever replaced. When you start dealing with aircraft being that old, you got airframes wearing out. That means they can't be using the airframes as much as they used to. So that's another issue of readiness, is that old aircraft. They are part of the F-35 program, but their procurement has been extraordinarily slow. Also, the Canadian military has a strength of 71,500 regulars and 30,000 reservists, but this is 16,000 troops below authorized strength, both regulars and reserves. Their recruitment process takes 18 to 24 months to complete, and this led to 15,000 people withdrawing their applications in 2023 alone. So on top of having limitations on operational capability just flat out neglect, talk about that here in a second, and the other part is they just can't get the people in there. And so here it is, NATO's talking about making this a priority section or a priority part of the world for them to operate in. And they're relying on Canada, and Canada is completely unprepared for this. So how do we get here? So the Canadian military has spends on average 1.3% on GDP and has been on a relatively declining since 1989. That was the last time it was above 2% was in 1989, 2 years before the end of the Cold War, and it's been decreasing steadily. Um, the NATO determined, so a couple things that go in there is um, Canada was a major partner and an effective partner in the NATO mission in Afghanistan. Well, Canada pulled out in 2011, 3 years before NATO wanted to stop their mission in 2014. So the Canadians got out early. They had significant casualties especially for the size of the force they had. Obviously not approaching U.S. levels, but they took significant casualty or British levels. But they did have significant casualties, especially when you do it on a per capita force basis. And at that point, so we've seen declining budgets of 1.3%. For the most part, the focus of that low defense to GDP budget of 1.3%, which did not really increase while running an relatively active ground war in Afghanistan. They didn't raise their defense level. That means you're giving up something on the strategic level, or you're giving up procuring modern weapon systems outside of basically your focus of your GDP budget is to support ground forces inside Canada or inside Afghanistan. So obviously by not raising your GDP level and then moving your focus onto maintaining ground forces in active combat or semi-active combat, real combat for the people that are getting shot at. So we'll call it just combat operations in Afghanistan. And if you're not raising your defense budget, you're giving up something out of the budget. And that's something that obviously was happening to maintain that without raising your defense spending into any significant portion. You are obviously giving up something in the future to maintain those operations. Canada said they pulled out again, is becoming unpopular. Their casualties were relatively high for the size of their country and the size of their deployment levels. They called it quits in 2011. Not saying the Canadian military called quits, but their civilian leadership said they're getting out of the war. And they just wanted to be done with the war. They wanted to be done with the military. And their defense spending stayed around 1.3% of GDP. So they didn't spend anything to try to reinvest into the forces that had been used in combat. They did not, during the combat operations, they were not spending above GDP. So they were obviously giving up something in their budget. Most likely, it looks like they were giving up purchasing capital equipment for both the Air Force and the Navy to support the operations and keep their budget relatively flat. That means that they're kind of, at that point, the military is starting to kind of what the Germans do is that when you stop ordering product or equipment, private industry doesn't just keep that capability to produce equipment. They don't make it available because it's a waste of money for them. So obviously, if the government's not spending on it, the procurement systems are just not going to be focused on it. So they're just not going to they can't ramp up immediately. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So they leave. Canada leaves Afghanistan in 2011. The Russians invade in 2014 the Ukraine to take Crimea and parts of the Donbass. This is before the big war, 2022. NATO at that point determined that all member states had to spend 2% of their GDP due to the Russian invasion. Now, Canada was one among most NATO countries that signed on to this goal and completely ignored it. And the Canadians did exactly that. Justin Trudeau became the Prime Minister of Canada in 2015. He has been a public supporter of NATO ever since he's been in there. But he did not believe that um, NATO was worth spending. I guess he didn't feel like he signed on to that, and he wasn't going to be committed to that. So, despite public statements, they made no effort to try to reach that 2% NATO goal. So, they made a so the NATO summit was in July, and Justin Trudeau was pressured to finally commit to the 2% target, and he finally agreed to that Canada would reach the 2% target by 2032. So Russia, the NATO is looking at the Arctic as being a priority, and they're talking about they will not reach their defense targets, their agreed upon GDP spending defense targets till 2032. And this didn't go over well with the provincial politicians who are calling for a better response from Justin Trudeau to try to get to 2% prior to 2032. So the problem with Canada is that they can go in there and produce, they can go ahead and start spending more, and they have been spending more. But a couple things I just talked about, industry is not going to be on the standby for higher budgets if that higher budget never comes. So they're going to move those resources or shutter completely. So the capability, especially in naval and shipbuilding, is not there like it was prior to 1989 when they spent 2% of their GDP. Last time they spent 2% of their GDP. But so you have capability where you don't have the industry immediately available to start producing. You have systematic issues with the procurement issues. So what happens is a couple things that go on with the procurement. And again, procurement is one of the issues that's causing the chronic readiness issue. Is you have defense spending that was low, it's starting to ramp up, but then you don't have the industry there to immediately pick up the process. There is cost overruns, obviously, because industries are having to bring their capabilities or their capacity back up to levels to fill a government contract. The Parliament in Canada has an oversight issue, just like they do in the U.S., and so that's fair. But they changed their minds in midstream of programs that had already been decided upon. They go back and review. Okay, that's part of oversight, valid. But then they make changes to those programs, which causes more overruns, which leads to more issues, questioning issues about the programs, because now they're more expensive because they've changed something in midstream over what they agreed upon. And they're doing this without increasing significantly their GDP. So they're adding problems, they're canceling programs or putting programs in persistent review process. And so it's slowing down. And then as you slow things down, private companies cannot just stop and restart at no cost. It's going to cause cost overruns on top of an industry that is well known for cost overruns. Again, it's part of the procurement process that you run in the West. I would pick it over a state process like the Chinese or the Russians, but it's part of private industry where you low bid to try to get the contract, and then you try to get back some of those expenses through adding more goodies or forcing cost overruns. As far as programs take longer and longer to procure, they need more money, and they just ask for the back end because it's easier for Western governments to pay for increased costs of a program than trying to scrap and start all over. The Canadians' procurement process coming through the Parliament takes the worst of both worlds in that they don't cancel and start over for a more realistic contract. They just go in there and they change it, hold up the program, make changes to it, and then apparently seem surprised the costs rise. Now that's being simplistic about it. And there is a role for Parliament to play in oversight, but they are making the problem worse on how they approach it, whether through how they go through their bid processes, when they make a decision to bring on for procurement. Also, again, midstream changes to procurement processes, cancellation of procurement processes. It's the worst of both worlds. And all this puts pressure on the Canadian military. And, the politicians get upset that they're 50% readiness, or they get upset with the government, but it's government policy that's caused this. And so, again, this is part of the West about having the civilian governments running the militaries, but the Canadian approach has been tortuous on trying to get their the readiness issues addressed. And so all this just delays after delays after delays, often again self-inflicted, where sometimes just pay the cost, maybe be more judicious in awarding your contracts, or accept the fact that you're going to have cost overruns and pay that, but instead just delaying all this. And so it looks like the Canadian procurement process, it looks like the readiness issues are not going to be addressed for Canada for better part of 10 years. And that's being the rosy picture. So it does not look like it's going to be good. So what the problem is that if you're sitting there and it's basically a funnel, if Canada is not going to fix the procurement issues and the oversight issues and the awarding of contracts issues, or maybe they have to go through on the procurement process and the bid process, maybe extend outside of Canada to, I know a lot of it does come from outside of Canada, but maybe they have to go look at a foreign buyer to be able to address this issue. Because basically you can put money into a funnel and you can get a bigger funnel, but if you don't make that opening, you're just going to be backing up the money. As you back up spending, to sit there and say, well, you can't take the new program until you finish this program. You're going to cause, again, cost overruns, you're going to have delays, and that means your readiness issues are not going to be addressed. Just the fact that you talk about just the amount of red tape inside Canada, why does it take 24 months to complete an application process to get into the military? Now, Canada is trying to force that through, is saying opening up recruitment to non-citizens that have permanent residency status. That's not unusual for NATO. The U.S. does it where it's a pathway to citizenship, or speed. It doesn't guarantee citizenship, but it puts you on a fast track for citizenship if you join the military, being a permanent residence. And even they do the Dreamers, which are minors that were brought across the border through no volition of their own. So the U.S. does it. The French, famously, French Foreign Legion. So it's not unusual for opening up non-citizens to be in the military. Is it ideal? No. It's nice to have people that are invested in society, but it's not unusual that Canadians are doing that. So again, no real criticism there. But if you take 24 months to finish an application to get in the military, and you're 16,000 troops and 15,000 withdrew in 2023, it seems like a big red light issue. Why is it so significant? Now, having worked with the Canadians when I was in the military, one thing, and in Canada, when they were in Afghanistan, they were considered one of the honest brokers that all sides really wanted to work on me on the Afghanistan side, because the Canadians' international reputation as far as a government goes. So they had an effective and outsized role in Afghanistan. Also, high quality individuals that they brought into their military. These guys were sharp. They were in great physical shape. They were dedicated to the mission. They were very well paid. Generally, their promotions were slower, but that meant that there being much more expertise in their areas through just experience alone. And again, because they paid them so well. So it was no knock on the Canadian military. The Canadians have been known for creating a high quality military of troops and training. And so a lot of this obstacle, the 50% readiness, it would be not caused by the individual Canadian servicemen. Or even when I went to a master's program dealing with these guys, were just the Canadian guys were just extremely smart, extremely bright, extremely motivated. So it's not a personnel issue as far as quality of personnel. It's an issue where they just can't get these people in. Is it, again, do you want to sacrifice? I would have to go in there. What's the recruitment process? What is causing that backlog? But just to go 24 months to bring somebody in to the military, it seems excessive, and it's probably endemic of some of the issues that Canada is dealing with when it comes to getting more quality personnel into their military. So the Trudeau's government, they adopted a lot of these problems. They came into power in 2015. The procurement issues have not been a problem. 2011, when I talked about that when the Canadians backed out, Canada was spending 1.3% roughly while Canada was in Afghanistan. That means they weren't spending it on other capital goods, which again, that causes procurement issues because companies that produce equipment or do even the research and development, they were not getting the money, so they were shutting down. And so it's hard to sit there and say how much a program is going to cost when you haven't done the research and development on to understand all aspects of it. So the decision to not increase defense budgets while Canada was at war in 2011 is definitely one of the big hangovers that's kind of in a long history of more and more hangovers in the procurement process in Canada. But that was probably one that damaged them more than anything. So Justin Trudeau's government adopted this. They came and played. They took over this program. They became the head of the government, and they did not try to address this issue that was known. They basically ignored it. They ignored military spending. They allowed the military to decline in readiness factor. So the Trudeau government has been in place since 2015. So they talk about 9 years and have done nothing. And they're talking about not reaching 2% till 2032, but they still have not adequately come up with a program to address the procurement and the oversight issues and other issues that are slowing down readiness. They have done nothing. And they're talking about 2032 before they reach 2%. And you're talking about readiness is not going to be significantly addressed for at least 10 years. And this is so as larger parts of the Arctic are becoming available or passable because of retreating ice sheets. Russia and Canada are now at the forefront of the discussion, and Canada is not ready for this. So the Trudeau government, like all things, has gone in there and promised to increase defense spending by $5.9 billion prior to the 2032 goal of 2%. So this is slowly marching them towards the 2% goal, but doesn't get them there. But that's $5.9 billion over 5 years. And that does not, again, no changes to the procurement process. Part of that $5.9 billion increase announced by the Trudeau government is for increased specialized sensors for the Arctic, additional standalone missiles, and helicopters to help patrol the region. Interesting about the missiles that if you've got a readiness issue and your chronic issues of readiness that are not being addressed, why would you agree to introduce a new weapon system before you fix the process? This advanced weapons, I could just see this going overboard. Now, you do have to keep up with modern warfare, but there are so many other issues that Canada has to deal with. And so what's going to happen is that Canada, by not addressing these issues that they know exist, and NATO has made the Arctic a priority, and Canada cannot fulfill its priority, does that mean that other countries are going to have to operate inside Canada to help them defend their region, whether it's on a rotating basis? North American air defense is already a U.S.-Canada, so there already is some trades or some Canadians in U.S. bases, mainly Air Force, maybe Space Force, and vice versa, where you're seeing some Air Force and Space Force assets in Canada, mainly around early warning as part of North American air defense agreements. But it's probably going to be something more than that. Or NATO's just going to have to agree that there's going to be a big gap in the defense of the Arctic region because Canada is not up to the job. Now, a number of this complacency, and this is before Justin Trudeau, but Justin Trudeau has been a major problem in this area, is Canada does not have an existential threat. So they do not have to put a lot of effort into their military. And that shows in polls that the many Canadian people, I probably imagine more in the East than the West, do not view the military as a area of investment for Canadian society dollars. And that probably reflects the fact that they're sitting around 1.3 million to 1.3% of GDP, even when fighting a war in Afghanistan, and never moved off. They did not see this as an adequate investment of resources for Canada. And so Canada can think like this because they know that any existential threat to Canada is a threat to the United States, and the United States will not allow something to happen that risk Canadian security at the peril of U.S. security. So Canada has the luxury that Plan B, or I even say Plan A Part 2, is just rely on the U.S. to do it for them. And that sounds harsh, and I hate to sit there and say it to the any Canadian listeners out there, is that's an unfortunate fact. I understand if I was in the government and somebody else was paying for my defense, yeah, I'd probably just go ahead and say, well, in the end, I don't need to spend this extra, I don't need to buy an extra upgraded Super Hornet fighters, because in the end, you know, the U.S. will cover it if we have to. So, you know, you can say Mexico thinks a lot of the same way. They don't have to worry about existential threats. Is it the Canadians' fault? Well, yeah, it's a matter of thinking. It's created where they know that they don't have to completely stand on their own feet and defend their own turf, because in the end, the U.S. will do it. And the U.S. has to do it because, again, you don't want to open up the whole Arctic region being exploited by the Russians. And NATO knows that. So it's the unfortunate fact of just some of the thinking of us, of a governments and successive governments that don't see defense spending as a priority for their own self-preservation, because in the end, their self-preservation is assured by them being a member of NATO and being a member of North America and having southern neighbor of the United States. And so, yeah, that's just one of the unfortunate facts of it, is that Canada doesn't have to concern themselves with their existence, because their existence is guaranteed by the U.S. Again, don't mean to be harsh, but that's one of the real, as Kissinger would say, that's real politics, realpolitik. So that's interesting things. Again, Canada will get there. Again, they have, I always admired the Canadian military because these guys were really good. And definitely consummate professionals. I think the longest shot by a sniper was a Canadian. So these guys train, and they train well. So it's unfortunate that the readiness issue should never be reflected on the individual Canadian service member. These men and women are good at what they do. It just seems like they're, like so many, is their government is not at the same level of professionalism, same quality of character. I think many people and throughout the world could see that of their government. So anyway, that is this week's discussions. Thank you for listening. Please consider supporting my work. Again, I've talked about this is not I hate it to be a numbers game, but it is a numbers game, because the more followers, more subscribers I have, even free subscribers, it does give you an amount of credibility. Couple programming notes is the West Philippine newsletter has no longer will be weekly. It had been declining when it first came out. I was hitting about 5,000 views between Substack, YouTube, and Rumble. it has decreased. I think the last newsletter is right around 60 or 75, I think, once you threw in the, well, it's below 100. So it had precipitously dropped. I don't know if it's a case of distribution. Again, most of my views were in YouTube and Rumble, and that's where the fall off has come. Not so much in Substack, but the Substack numbers were much lower. So I don't know if it's a distribution issue, the change of algorithm that caused it, but it is obviously not getting the traction it used to. So it will exist in some form. It will either become a monthly newsletter because it's still an interesting area to keep up with, or maybe go back to kind of what I did before when I talked about issues in the Philippines, where it's as events drive discussions of what's going on in the West Philippine Sea. So still keeping an eye on the area. I will still write on that area, but it will no longer be a weekly part of the lineup on Substack, YouTube, and Rumble. Locals as well. Also, because I have seen some of my work being, looks like it's been uncredited in some other sites. And now I talk about this. I talk about current events. I've talked about there's no original ideas on stuff. So it's easy when a current event comes up that me and some other writer or some other writer, multiple writers, write the same thing. But some of the wording that has come out has seemed kind of questionable. And so, and because I'm not getting the followers, in fact, my followers and subscribers has actually fallen by 10% from its high point, and when that wasn't a lot. So I'm going to, starting in the beginning of August, I will move to a paid only service to get the full access to articles. I will still provide samples. I will still provide, there will still be plenty of free content. You'll just have shortened writing, not be able to have full access to the written articles. I will still provide the video samples. I will still provide the video summaries. And probably, I think this podcast will probably remain available for free subscribers. So I'm still going to provide plenty of free content. It's just not going to be the full ability or all the full articles and all that. And really looking at the numbers is, for the most part, most of the views are driven by the summary and the sample content than it is by the full length content. So I think for the most part, the free subscribers on all the platforms are not really going to be impacted as far as views go. I'm sure it will impact some of the other things, some of my traffic, but it's just a matter of looking through my numbers. And just again, it looks like I'm getting some of my work. Looks like it's being used in an uncredited manner on various platforms. So it just seems like at this point, it's just best to go ahead. It'll be approaching a year. So it'll just be moving to a paid content. I'll probably look at maybe some type of incentive program, maybe another adding to changing the price as well. But we'll just see how it goes. I thank everybody that is a subscriber and everybody that's a follower. It's very much appreciated. Even non-followers, subscribers on the other forms of where I provide my content. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me. I really do appreciate it. I just think at this point, it's probably best to start moving towards something like this, where it's not giving away all the content, but at least provide information to all subscribers who listen to my listen and read my content. And again, that is very much appreciated. If you have any thoughts on it, please reach out to me on Substack. I will take time to answer those questions. So until next week, I thank you for all of you for listening. I hope all of you have a great week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.